Our speaker today is Dr. Louise Zavala. Dr. Zavala, in addition to being a veterinarian, she also holds a master's of avian medicine from UGA, and she's a diplomat with the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. Dr. Zavala serves as the executive director of the Georgia Poultry Lab Network, which is headquartered here in Gainesville. So without further ado, Dr. Zavala, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everybody can see the screen great, so we'll get started. I titled my talk today, Avian Influenza 2022. I wish I didn't have to give this talk. In other words, I kind of wish that we had another quiet year, but that is not the case. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on issues related to backyard poultry and to exhibition, collections, companionship of poultry, as opposed to the commercial poultry industry. We reach out a lot to our commercial poultry partners throughout the year about avian influenza. So in this talk, it's kind of focused towards smaller flocks. So what I plan to do today, let me see. Yeah, what I plan to do today is go over the disease and what the disease is, and really why the threat, why are we talking right now about this? And we'll talk a little bit about prevention and a few other things in between. The first question I'm going to ask you, it's going to sound a little weird, is what shoes are you wearing? I want you to take 2 seconds to think about the shoes you're wearing. Are they the same shoes that you used this morning when you tended your flock? Or not? Are they the same shoes that you went to an auction or flea market with, where there was poultry? That's very important, a very important question, and we'll come back to it. So keep it in the back of your mind. Avian influenza is caused by a virus. And avian influenza viruses are named after the protein on their envelope. So you have a little cartoon of a virus here. And there's 2 different types of protein on the envelope of the virus. One is called hemagglutinin, H. There's 16 types of hemagglutinin, 1 to 16. And the N protein is called neuraminidase, and there's 9 types of those. So avian influenza viruses are named after those 2 proteins. For example, H1N1, you've heard of swine flu, H5N2, H7N9, etc. For poultry in particular, H5 and H7 are the most concerning. So if you hear on the news that we've got H5 or we got H7 in the environment or in birds, it is a concern. Hopefully after this presentation, you'll understand why those 2 are a concern. Avian influenza in waterfowl, ducks and geese, and other wild birds such as gulls and shorebirds usually cause no disease. So they can harbor this virus, they can shed the virus in the environment, but they can still migrate across continents. So they are natural carriers of avian influenza without making themselves sick. In gallinaceous birds, what is that? What's a gallinaceous bird? It's a ground-dwelling bird. Chickens, turkeys, quail, peacocks, guineas, etc. Those are gallinaceous birds. Avian influenza in those either causes a mild disease called low pathogenic avian influenza, or a severe catastrophic disease called highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI. HPAI is considered a foreign animal disease and is reportable to this state. The virus, the avian influenza viruses, normally don't affect humans. However, because avian influenza viruses are very good at changing and adapting, and even skipping hosts, changing hosts, public health departments are always monitoring outbreaks of avian influenza. However, the immediate concern with an outbreak of avian influenza is the loss of the birds themselves. Sometimes we're talking about companion birds. Sometimes we're talking about birds that are endangered. Sometimes we're talking about exhibition birds of high value, etc. So our concern is the loss of the birds. For commercial poultry, of course, is a paralysis of the industry and food supply, and the loss of production and trade. We do a lot of testing for avian influenza, especially in commercial poultry, but also quite a bit in non-commercial poultry. And because of all the testing that we do, we feel like we would not miss it. However, the participants in this webinar can really help us not miss it. We do about 400,000 tests per year. That was 2021 for avian influenza in different types of birds. There's a program called the NPIP, the National Poultry Improvement Plan. And that's a program that if you participate in it, your birds get tested for AI and get tested for other diseases. And this facilitates trade of birds, especially across state lines. Under the NPIP, commercial poultry flocks, get tested quite a bit. Broilers, breeders, layers, they get tested 1 to several times during their lifetime. Backyard flocks under the NPIP are tested once or twice a year, depending on the program they're under. Active surveillance also includes auctions and sales in Georgia, flea markets, where the Department of Agriculture collects random samples at flea markets, and we test them for AI. There's also some testing due to movement. If you want to move some birds, for example, from Georgia to Florida, Florida requires that you test them for avian influenza before you move them. Passive surveillance means birds that you bring to a laboratory for any reason, maybe because you found them dead, or because they have a problem, they can't walk, and this kind of thing. All those birds are tested for avian influenza, and that's called passive surveillance. Low-path avian influenza in this presentation is represented by little red dots. For low-path AI, we have occasional findings in this country just about every year. If it's H5 and H7, it's followed by a swift response by the states. Every state has a written plan for the control of H5 and H7 avian influenza of the low pathogenic type. Low-path AI viruses also circulate in wild waterfowl. But if those are H5 and H7 and contaminate a chicken flock or a chicken coop, they can adapt to chickens, which means that from a duck virus, they become a chicken virus. And unfortunately, these two types of viruses have the capability, if they circulate in chickens and turkeys, to mutate to the highly pathogenic type of avian influenza. This is why H5 and H7 are so critical to us, because of that possibility that they will mutate to high path AI if allowed to circulate. Highly pathogenic avian influenza, represented by the little lightning bolts, is a foreign animal disease. We had a large outbreak of it in 1983 in Pennsylvania, leading to destruction of millions of birds. There was a single flock in Texas in 2004. And then in 2014 and 15, we had a large outbreak. It was actually the largest outbreak of any exotic or foreign animal disease in the US. We'll talk about that a little bit. So we have a duck on the left of this slide, infected with low-path AI. He's perfectly happy, he's healthy, he's flying across continents, but he's shedding low-path AI virus in its feces. If this virus gets into a flock of chickens and is allowed to circulate, it can mutate to high path and lead to severe disease in the flock. The other scenario is the duck that would have, instead of a low-path virus in its system, a high-path virus that it would be shedding in its feces while flying across continents. In this case, when this virus gets into poultry, the severe disease happens a lot quicker than with low-path AI. In the US, we consider that we have 4 major migratory flyways for wild waterfowl. In red on the left is a Pacific flyway. In the middle, the green one is the Central Flyway. In blue is a Mississippi Flyway. And in black is the Atlantic Flyway, where Georgia is. What happened in 2014 is that the migratory routes, the birds in the spring go north when it's warmer in the north. At that time, in 2014, there was a massive outbreak of avian influenza in Asia, China, Russia, Eastern Europe, and the whole continent of Asia was going through a really, really severe outbreak. So the migratory waterfowl, when they were ready, when in the fall of 2014, spring of 2000, when they migrated up towards Alaska, towards Siberia and Alaska, and mingled with the birds from Alaska and the North American flyways, those birds mingling brought the virus to North America. So that when the birds came down, migrated down, the first case of avian influenza in 2015 was actually in British Columbia, not in the US. It was in the Pacific Flyway, and quickly it was detected in Oregon and Washington, and then started the outbreak of avian influenza that we now have in our history. So while we talk about this, let's talk a little bit about this picture. If you could just remember this picture from this talk, that means that you'll have learned a lot about avian influenza. This is a northern pintail duck. This duck was hunted down in California in 2014. So when it was killed, the hunters realized it had a band, as you can see, a leg band. And the band, if you can read on this slide, says Tokyo on it, which means that this duck that came down in California was actually banded in Japan. What is interesting is it was hunted down in 2014, but it had its date of a banding on this ring, and the date of banding was the year 2000, which means that this duck migrated back and forth between the continents several times in the 14 years of its life. This, if we're not too sure that that's actually happening with the waterfowl migrating across continents, this is a very, very good proof of it. So in 2015, once the virus got a hold of the US continent, it moved across 3 of our flyways, the Pacific, the Central, and the Mississippi. There were actually 2 viruses in circulation, H5N2 and H5N8, and that's after a reassortment in Canada with one of our North American low-path strains. However, we had a perfect storm because we had 2 high-path AI H5 types circulating in the country. It affected backyard first, and actually some wild birds also first that were outside. But it moved to commercial poultry and really did a lot of damage in actually 21 states, but especially in Minnesota, where it affected 109 flocks of turkeys, and in Iowa, where it infected 71 flocks of layers and turkeys. In total, that was 50 million birds infected or destroyed for a cost of $1 billion to the economy. And in total, 211 commercial flocks and 21 backyard flocks were infected with this virus. Here's what's interesting, and I'm leading to what's going on this year with this. In 2015, the same virus that caused all these problems in 21 states had been diagnosed in the green-winged teal in October 2014. In 2016, we had a very small outbreak of high-path AI in Indiana, very, very limited. But guess what? Just a few months before that, in November of 15, diving ducks in the state of Kentucky were diagnosed with the same virus. In 2017, when Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky had an outbreak of low path AI, with a couple of those cases being high path AI, sure enough, that too was preceded with the detection of the same H7N9 virus in a blue-winged teal in Wyoming the September before. I guess what I'm trying to tell you here is detection of avian influenza viruses in waterfowl are a very effective early warning system for us. How do we recognize it? How would you know you even have that in your flock? If you look at these pictures, those are the signs you'd be looking for. You may see those, and I'll explain a little bit later why I say you may see those. So starting on the left, top left, you have a bird with very dark cyanotic combs and wattles. Same for the top right, cyanotic wattles. Depressed birds with swollen heads, dark legs. And at the bottom right, you have a turkey with neurological signs. Now, those are things that you might see. And the reason I say that is you may see nothing at all. Sometimes high path AI kills birds so quickly that you don't even get to see clinical signs. However, in the process of dying, one thing that is very impressive in those flocks is a depression, basically. There is no noise in these flocks. They go very quiet. They stop eating and drinking and laying eggs. And again, you may see mortality without the signs. So of course, if you have any concerns about any birds at all that you know, please call immediately and we'll get into phone numbers a little bit later. High path AI is controlled by stamping out. Stamping out means we depopulate the flock, we clean it, we control, we test everything around it in a zone, we control the spread, then we clean and disinfect and start over. The tolerance for this disease in the US is pretty much zero. We're considered free of high path AI in our commercial and non-commercial poultry, and we certainly want to stay that way. Now, you may ask, how about vaccination? Why don't we just vaccinate if it's in the ducks to protect ourselves, protect our flocks? Vaccination is a complex issue. It's actually a USDA decision. It's not a state decision. And it's complicated in the sense that you would have to have millions of doses of vaccine that match exactly what comes into flocks every year, which is very difficult to do in a timely manner. If we start to vaccinate, it paralyzes exports because it interferes with surveillance. Vaccinated birds would have antibodies to the virus, making surveillance a little more complicated. In addition, vaccine would not stop the spread of the virus. It would just control the clinical signs and mortality. So if a decision was made in this country to vaccinate for avian influenza, it would be for the goal of helping with eradication, not long-term vaccination. Back to the state plans. So every state in the US has an AI, H5, and H7 response and containment plan. Basically, the affected flock gets quarantined, depopulated, the carcasses are disposed of, then the premise is cleaned and disinfected, and there's indemnity available for high path AI. Then we draw a zone around the affected premise, and surveillance starts for all flocks, commercial and backyard, within 2 and 6 miles around an infected premise. And any movement is under permit until the premise in particular has been decontaminated. So if you have that premise in the middle of the 2 mile zone, that one and that one only gets depopulated. But then the surveillance is very intense in the 2 and the 6 mile zone. The little X's that I drew in the 2 mile zone is an example of backyard flocks. There may be 4 backyard flocks, there may be 25 in that zone. They would be checked and tested as needed to make sure that the virus has not spread to them. Disposal of the carcasses, for small flock, we would use either burial or incineration or composting. Those would be probably the three methods of choice, followed by cleaning and disinfection of the premises. And then we would test for virus before the premise is allowed to get birds again. So we're about halfway. Let's recap. Avian influenza is caused by migratory wild waterfowl. It's carried by them and they don't get sick, so they continue to fly and migrate. The virus can mutate to cause severe disease, especially the viruses of the H5 and H7 types. Finding it early is very critical to prevent the spread. Okay, let's move on. Why are we concerned now? What is going on that has prompted Dr. Hennebel to have this webinar? All through 2021 and actually the better part of 2020, in Europe and Asia, but especially in Western Europe, there was a massive outbreak of avian influenza in wild birds and in commercial poultry. They had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of detections those 2 years over on the other side of the pond, especially in Western Europe. Okay, so that was one thing. If you look at commercial poultry during the same time, with commercial poultry, low path AI, H5 and H7, now you know what I'm talking about, I love it. So for domestic poultry, H5 and H7 low path, there were a few detections. As you can see there, South Africa, Western Europe. But look at the cases of high path AI in commercial poultry in Western Europe and some in Asia during the same time. It was massive and it just did not stop. So the detections of high path virus, it was the H5 type and it was a Eurasian lineage, Europe, Asia, Eurasian lineage that was circulating, very, very pathogenic to domestic poultry. Now you noticed the first slides with these maps, the ducks were carrying the high path virus directly. So when the contamination from the ducks to the poultry happens, it's a high path virus that is being spread. So in this continent, the industry and USDA and all the stakeholders, we were looking at this with great concern because the bird migrations from Western Europe come directly to the Atlantic flyway. And Georgia is in the Atlantic flyway. So now, fast forward to December 2021, there was a detection in Canada of an H5 high path AI Eurasian lineage virus in the great black back gull that had neurological signs. That's a little bit unusual that it makes wildlife sick, but this particular gull, had clinical signs, neurological signs. A few days later, it was detected in a small exhibition flock in Newfoundland, Canada, Atlantic flyway. Interestingly, this was the first detection of a high path H5 of Eurasian lineage since 2015 in the US. So we got pretty excited about that and nervous. Okay, so this is mid-December 2021. About a year and a half ago, USDA resumed the National Wildlife Service resumed their surveillance of waterfowl in the US flyways. This helps us a lot in the poultry industry and with anybody interested in poultry, because as we know, it's a good early warning system. When we find it in ducks, we know that it's around to infect our chickens and other gallinaceous birds. For Georgia in particular, there are 3 watersheds that are being tested as we speak. They got some birds from the 3 watersheds back in the summer and in the fall. Now we're in the winter. So there's 3, Apalachicola, as you can see on the left, Altamaha, St. Mary's in the middle, and Ogeechee, Savannah on the right. The circles on this map is the relative concentration of poultry farms. The way they do that is they go to where ducks are hunted, hunting clubs, places like that, plantations, where they hunt ducks. And then they go in and swab the ducks that have been killed by the hunters. Or they do trapping, as you can see at the bottom. Occasionally they'll do that, trap a few, swab them, and release them. Unfortunately, after the December Newfoundland finding, there were a few in the northeast of low path. But unfortunately, North Carolina and South Carolina, this is from last week, got detections of the Eurasian H5 high path influenza virus in ducks collected by the Wildlife Service. Now, this is really close to Georgia. What are these purple counties in Georgia, Hart and McIntosh? Those are where H5 viruses were detected, but either the lineage or the pathogenicity of them is unknown, or it's a low path. The one in McIntosh County was a low path H5. But now, listening to me, now you know that we get pretty excited about these low path H5s, even if they're not of Eurasian origin. What's concerning this year is with this type of sampling, we find a higher, much higher percentage of ducks positive to H5 virus than we did previously doing similar samplings. Normally, it's between 2 and 3%. Now we have 20%. So there's a lot of ducks that are carrying these viruses and contaminating the environment. So if we look at disease sources for our flocks, so to the right, you have a hobby flock, exhibition, backyard, whatever, a flock that is not typically a commercial flock. To the left, you have disease sources, wild birds, ducks with avian influenza, other backyard flocks, other commercial flocks. That's the disease sources, okay? How is the virus gonna get from wildlife or from another farm to a small flocks in rural Georgia? Well, this way. First one is airborne. Airborne takes perfect condition. It takes wind, it takes cold conditions, and it takes direction. It takes the right direction. It's very difficult to prove airborne transmission of avian influenza from farm to farm or from a duck to a farm. So can it happen? Yes. Is it the most likely route of entry? Absolutely not. The most likely way that a small farm gets contaminated with avian influenza is feet, human feet, that go from a pond where they were fishing or hunting, or from an auction or flea market where they were shopping, etc. And then the feces and the virus get on our feet, and then we have access to that backyard flock and we infect it. Same for contaminated vehicles or little critters like small animals. Rats and mice can carry a virus pretty easily from farm to farm. So most likely way for avian influenza to get from a duck to a chicken is through a human. And through the feet of a human. This is a cartoon, but I think it explains it very well. It's a good one to put on the fridge, I think. So you have the virus, the little red dots, coming on the feet of the person to the chickens, right? But if you do something to stop that, by doing what? Disinfecting the boots, changing the boots, having dedicated boots, then the virus doesn't have much of a chance to infect the chickens. This is a very common slide or a very popular slides for you guys to know about, because you must be thinking, wait a minute, how long is the virus going to be in the environment for me to pick it up on my feet and walk on my flock with it, right? Well, ducks hang out around ponds and contaminate the pond with avian influenza. If the water in the pond is warm, like in the summer, it will survive maybe 1 month. But if the water in the pond is cool, like in the fall and the spring, 63 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, the virus can survive up to 6 months. At the bottom of the slide, you have duck poop. So if you have duck feces infected with avian influenza virus, and it's out there on the asphalt in the sun, the virus is not going to last long, minutes maybe. But if the feces are protected from the sun, they're in the shade, and it's 90 degrees out, it'll probably survive 4 days, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 days. But 39 degrees Fahrenheit, like it is right now in Georgia, that virus can survive 35 days in the shade, in the feces of an infected duck. So what can you do now? We always tell poultry growers and backyard poultry owners that they're the first line of defense. Why? Because you're the one that's going to see this first. It's your birds. You're the one that sees them every day. You're the ones that know what kind of noise they make, how active they are, how many eggs they lay, etc. So you're the ones that we're asking today to please make sure that you tell somebody if you're concerned about avian influenza in your flock. You need to tighten your biosecurity, which means protect your flock. Rethink how your coop is. Is it locked? Does everybody have access? Can I go with one of you tonight and see your birds, or do you have restriction for visitors? That kind of thing. You have to assume that everything outside your coop is contaminated. And then you separate the inside from the outside. It may be that another thing that's really important is to prevent access of your coops to the wild ducks, right? It may be that you need some netting on top of it, or some kind of roof on top of the coop, at least right now. And another thing to do is to disinfect everything going in to the coop to make sure you don't bring in the virus, including your feet. So before you place a foot in a chicken house or in a chicken coop, have you effectively separated the inside from the outside of the coop to the inside of the coop? It's a very basic biosecurity procedure with actually any type of livestock, but very important with chickens, to have dedicated boots when you tend your chickens. Wear dedicated clothing and wash your hands. Those three things will probably keep off 95% of disease agents from your flock. What's risky business around a chicken coop? Contact with other birds, whether they're domestic or wild. If you have a chicken coop, right, and right next to the chicken coop, you have bird houses. I know they're two very nice hobbies, but they're not really compatible. You don't want to attract wildlife to your chicken coop. So you don't want to attract ducks, you don't want to attract songbirds, you don't want to attract anything to them. Okay, so that means you clean up your feed spills. You don't have bird houses there, and you don't do anything to attract other birds. Don't visit other coops, and if you do, wash up before you check on yours. Make sure that you're with pond water or with waterfowl, and that you don't either. And if you do have contact with waterfowl, again, wash up, shower, clean clothes, clean footwear before you go back to your coop. Very important to control animals, insects, and rodents, and keep the birds inside. Dr. Hennebel has recommended that birds kept on pasture be brought inside until further notice because of the immediate threat brought to us by the migratory waterfowl in Georgia. What's the state doing now about all this? Well, we're planning for the use of our resources. We're exercising. We've done that pretty constantly since 2015, but we're exercising and maintaining the equipment that we need. Lots of communications between USDA, the state vet, and the GDA staff, and the industry, and you guys, communicating and preparing, like this webinar. So in the spring in 2015, we had high-path AI, especially in Minnesota and Iowa. In spring in 2016, we had high-path AI in Indiana. In the spring of 2017, we had low-path and high-path AI in 4 states in the Southeast. In 18 and 19, we had avian influenza circulating across several states, but it was low-path, of a low-path type. In the spring of 2020, we had high-path in South Carolina, along with a few cases of low-path in South and North Carolina around them. And then right after that, 2020, 2021, this massive European outbreak of avian influenza in waterfowl and in commercial poultry. That seems to have made its way here in the Atlantic flyway of the US in the winter of 2022 with the duck findings. So what do you want to remember from this? Watch your flock. You know your flock and your coop better than anybody, and call if you have AI concerns. This is a number for the AI hotline, but you can call your extension agent, you can call your veterinarian, call somebody. They'll know what to do. Just make sure that if you're concerned about your flock, that you tell someone. Message number 2 is it's not going away. It's a global problem. It's particularly bad or a concern right now because this is when we have incursions in poultry in the US is in the spring coming up. So we're going to be pretty excited about this for about at least 2 or 3 months, at least until April or so. And then the number 3 message is protect your coop and focus on high-risk areas. Entering the coop, anybody visiting it, contact with waterfowl and animal control. No one can afford this. You can't afford to lose your coop. You may be into conservation. You may have these birds as really important companions. You may have a collection of a certain breed. You can't afford to lose this coop. The poultry industry cannot afford to have an incursion, nor does the state of Georgia or the US in general. So, you know, I work at the poultry lab, and if I went to your coop today, what would I see? Just think about it. If you're on this call and you have some backyard poultry, what would I see? When I leave your place, first of all, would you let me in? Do you have visitor control? If you do let me in, and I look at your birds and I leave, would I report that you're low, medium, or high risk of getting a poultry disease like avian influenza? Just think about all the risk factors we talked about and think about if your birds are at risk or not. And then try to mitigate that risk.